Welcome to Romanticism and Gothic Literature. This is going to be our first exploration into short stories based on the American literary timeline. This is the birth of fiction and the imagination. What is a literary movement? A literary movement is a general term for pieces of literature by different authors, usually over the same time period, who share a similar impetus for writing in some way. Usually these authors are considered part of a movement because they have similar ideas about something. In other words, their writing shares similar traits, happens at about the same time, and something has happened in the world to make them want to write. Typically, it's something not so great. So, for example, The Great Gatsby is part of a literary movement where many authors were so disillusioned and upset that people couldn't achieve the American dream anymore, or that the American dream had morphed because there was a huge rise of wealth and greed. We're first going to look at the traits of American Romanticism, and then look at one of the movements that happened beneath it, Gothic literature. American Romanticism was really focused on faith and intuition. They valued them over reason. Power lies in the individual. Writers from this time period really believed that it was no longer religion or the government, but instead it was the individual who needed to explore their own freedom. Nature is held above civilization, which was becoming more and more corrupt, or at least it was perceived that way, because there were technological advances and things that felt like it was pulling the individual away from the elements that were really important to them. So American Romanticism writers felt that nature needed to be explored and really honored and cherished. Authors started looking to the past for guidance rather than future progress. Again, this was linked to technological advances and other things, but really authors felt that we needed to look at our mistakes of the past, but also our successes to understand how to proceed in the future. Inspiration and power were derived from the human imagination, which was something really lacking in previous writing. This is why short stories and poetry blossomed in this time period, because they typically come from the imagination. There was a renewed belief in the supernatural, not exactly tied to religion, but just a belief that supernatural powers existed. There was also an interest in myths and folk tales and things like that. On Thursday, we'll be looking at some poems actually from the American Romantic time period, but we're going to be focusing on one branch of Romanticism, often called Dark Romanticism. We're going to be looking at Gothic literature. I'm guessing that the word Gothic is something that you've heard of because so many influences of Gothic literature still are around today. If you don't recognize the silhouette to the right, that's our good old friend Edgar Allan Poe, who is one of the most famous of the Gothic literature authors. I also included a quote at the bottom from Stephen King, who's certainly a modern author, but very, very influenced by Gothic literature. He says we make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones, and that's something we're going to explore, since Gothic literature really explored the darkness of the human mind. What were the traits of Gothic literature? And as I explore them, I'd like you to think about present-day movies and books and things that might share these. These stories typically take place in haunted mansions, abandoned buildings, and places that make the protagonist feel alone and afraid, although often the story is actually happening in their head. There is typically a damsel in distress. I realize this is a very old-fashioned point of view, but this was an older type of literature. The atmosphere is always eerie and foreboding. There's a sense of dread for the reader and absolutely for the protagonist. Speaking of the protagonist, they're typically a brooding loner, most often a man, and with a fatal flaw that makes him not the typical shining Superman we might think of when I say the word hero. I hate to use a Twilight reference, but think of Edward Cullen. He absolutely represents a Gothic hero. The antagonist is typically a ghost or a demon or a supernatural force that preys on the protagonist's worst fears and their flaws. The weather is always a mess. There's rain, there's fog, there's ice, anything again to go back to that atmosphere of something eerie and foreboding. Foreshadowing consistently provides all the clues that the protagonist is headed towards danger. Think of horror movies where you want to scream at the screen because we know what's coming, but they seem not to. That happens a lot in Gothic literature as well, where the reader can see danger coming, but the protagonist not so much. Symbols and dreams are the most popular ways the Gothic authors drop clues to the reader, and again, often the clueless protagonist. So we're going to be looking a lot at those symbols, as well as where there are either actual dreams that the protagonist has or whether the story feels like it's hitting a dreamlike state.